Hello, this is Shadman. Welcome to my conference presentation for Foundations. Today I will be talking about George Gissing's novel New Grub Street and the ambivalent realism that the novel encompasses. In the 21st century, George Gissing is remembered as a writer of realist fiction, but in the late 19th century, when he wrote New Grub Street, realism was changed in its presentation within fiction and other genres were welcomed. After reading New Grub Street, I wondered if Gissing's use of creating both realist and non-realist subjects and the interactions between these subjects would hint towards the ambivalence of realism in his writing of the novel. The subject I want to talk about in my presentation today is Harold Biffen, author of Mr. Bailey, Grocer. Some of the questions I hope to answer throughout my presentation are, why does Gissing involve Biffen, a realist subject, in the one and only dramatic scene in New Grub Street, the apartment fire? How does Gissing present ambivalent realism in Biffen's story? Has Gissing used Biffen's story as an argument against realism? The main question I hope to explore is New Grub Street more focused on praising realism or satirizing realism? In his article, George Gissing's Ambivalent Realism, Aaron Matz very effectively describes Gissing's background with realism, and the account that Matz provides really draws insight into the ambivalent realism that Gissing communicates in his writing. George Gissing was the archetypal writer of realist fiction. In an issue of The Athenaeum in 1891, a reviewer once praised Gissing for the authenticity with which he rendered contemporary life. The reviewer wrote, "His matter is of the moment, and his treatment and touch are distinctly realistic." But at the same time, Gissing also received negative reviews about the realism that he presented in his writings. In an issue for a journal titled The Author, a reviewer by the name Andrew Lang stated, "Gissing sees everything in black. This is the burden of what is cruelly called realism." Matz is inspired by the strange immersion of the debates of realism in New Grub Street and believes that these debates make New Grub Street seem utterly prophetic. At the same time, Matz states that this focus on realism makes the novel appear awkward, as Gissing is alternatively sympathetic to the idea of a realistic narrative and at the same time is ruthlessly satirical about it. According to Matz, realism as a concept in the late 19th century was known by writers to be something unimaginative and indeed insipid, the mere duplication of everyday life. In 1895, 4 years after the release of New Grub Street, Gissing wrote an essay titled The Place of Realism in Fiction, and it was published in a journal called The Humanitarian. Gissing began his essay by suggesting that realism is a concept that might not have a place in fiction whatsoever. But when he wrote New Grub Street, he was careful to insist that the tradition of realism in his novel emerged from a spirit of upheaval or confusion. Harold Biffen is portrayed as a realist subject from the moment he is introduced in New Grub Street. He is described as a very dull figure, a man of excessive meagerness that would all but have qualified him to enter an exhibition in the capacity of living skeleton. Biffen lives on a very unhealthy diet. He is unable to afford decent clothing, and his appearance throughout New Grub Street is often out of place. He sustains his diet on bread and dripping and peas pudding. According to Sue McPherson in her article Gissing's New Grub Street and the Wider Concerns of Impoverishment, these foods are classified as a staple diet of the poor within the period and setting New Grub Street was written in. Biffen is described as a realist recurringly throughout New Grub Street, and this is because he dedicates most of his time to writing his realistic fiction, Mr. Bailey, Grocer. The title, Mr. Bailey, Grocer, draws satire towards the realist subject. It draws attention to the absurdity behind a work of fiction that focuses on reproducing contemporary urban life, yet within the monotonous setting of a busy, everyday grocery shop. Biffen starves himself as he works towards the end of his novel. He struggles with the final half page of his book. But eventually, he gives in to the irresistible temptation to complete his manuscript in the same night instead of postponing his writing until the next day. He sat down, wrote with unusual speed, and at 10:30 wrote with magnificent flourish, "The End." Biffen is unable to sleep after finishing his manuscript. There is no coal nor wood left in his apartment, and his feet are frozen. So he leaves his apartment to go for a walk. The fact that Biffin's apartment has no more coal or wood and lacks many other basic necessities demonstrates the minimal chance of Biffen starting a fire in his own apartment. A fire burning down Biffin's apartment is very unexpected, and this is evident in the apathy he feels when he first hears that a fire broke out in a building on an unknown street. This was too common an occurrence to disturb his equanimity. He wondered absently in which street the fire might be, but trudged on without a thought of making investigation. Upon discovering that the fire is happening in Clipstone Street, Biffen panics and rushes back to his building, desperately with the dread of losing his manuscript, his toil, his one hope. The realist scarcely stayed to listen to a warning that the fumes were impassable. With head bent, he rushed to the next landing. This chapter, chapter 31, A Rescue and a Summons, is very unrealistic compared to the rest of Gissing's novel. Biffen has risked his life to save a manuscript that would eventually prove to be unsuccessful. This scene demonstrates a strong example of ambivalent realism. If Biffen did not have the necessities to even create a fire in the fireplace of his apartment, the chances of his apartment of being affected by a fire would be very unlikely. In fact, the fire was caused by one of his neighbors who kicked over a fire lamp and set the building ablaze. Biffen, who would never expect to encounter a fire in his apartment, made the best use of his physical abilities to dramatically rescue his manuscript from the deadly fire. The difference between what Biffen would have been expected to do and what he actually does is what creates ambivalent realism in this scene. This chapter in Gissing's novel is so dramatic that it certainly does not praise realism, rather it brutally satirizes it. Biffen imagines the headline that newspapers would have written about him if he were to die while trying to save his manuscript. The daily manuscript would have made a leader out of me. This poor man was so strangely deluded as to the value of a novel in a manuscript, which it appears he has just completed, that he positively sacrificed his life in the endeavor to rescue it from flames. The fact that Gissing is able to imagine what a headline would write about him if he were to die while trying to save his manuscript emphasizes on how dramatic the apartment fire scene is. Why does Gissing include this scene in his novel? Why is a realist subject like Biffen, who is normally so drawn to the mundane, involved in the most dramatic scene in New Grub Street? In chapter 32, Reardon becomes sick and dies. Biffen becomes devastated and plans to marry Amy, Reardon's widow. Eventually, however, he is unable to marry Amy, and this is the main reason that contributes to the suicide he commits shortly afterwards in the next couple of chapters of the novel. Also, Biffen receives several negative reviews about his novel, Mr. Billy Grocer. One of the reviews read, "Here is another of those intolerable productions for which we are indebted to the spirit of groveling realism." The analysis of Biffen's downfall and suicide evokes the question, is Biffen's failure with Mr. Billy Grocer a reflection of how Gissing saw his own realist writing during the time he wrote New Grub Street? Biffen sinks deeper into loneliness and becomes depressed. Companionless, inert, he suffered the tortures, which are so ludicrous and contemptible to the happily married. He also sinks into poverty. A week or two more would see him at the end of his money. One night, after returning from the museum reading room, Biffen buys several bottles of pills, writes a letter to his brother at Liverpool, walks up Putney Hill, and after sunset commits suicide. Before Biffen commits suicide, his last thoughts trace back to a time when he was not influenced by literary realism. Only thoughts of beautiful things came into his mind. He had reverted to an earlier period of life when as yet no mission of literary realism had been imposed upon him and when his passions were still soothed by natural hope. Biffen's thoughts right before his suicide evoke the following question. If Biffen were to go back in time, would he avoid the influence of literary realism? Based on the analysis of Biffen's story and his personality as a realist subject, it is arguable that it is realism that has killed Biffen. With Biffen's suicide, the theme of realism in New Grub Street has killed itself. Biffen's death is a significant moment in Gissing's novel. In this moment, the pressures of the realistic world, including pressures with competition, isolation, and the economy, overwhelm a writer who has attempted to capture all these pressures in his realist fiction novel, Mr. Billy Grocer. Gissing's own feelings for realism are embedded in Biffen's realist character. Although Biffen's death is a significant moment in New Grub Street, it does not mark the ending of the novel. Biffin's secondhand overcoat provides insight into his poor living conditions and his loyalty towards his manuscript. It also plays a role in foreshadowing his death. When visiting Reardon one day, Biffen refuses to take off his overcoat because he is only wearing a shirt underneath his overcoat. During the time and setting in which New Grub Street is situated in, it would be considered informal to wear a shirt without a suit jacket when visiting someone's home. When Amy asks why Biffen is sitting in his overcoat, his reply is, "Please excuse me, Mrs. Reardon. It happens to be more convenient this evening." In shame, Biffen is unable to disclose that he is not dressed formally underneath. Amy and Reardon do not discuss this matter until after Biffen leaves. Biffen has sold his suit jacket in order to save money. The ending of their discussion accurately foreshadows the poverty and starvation that eventually overwhelms the realist writer. When Biffen is gone, Amy says to Reardon, "That poor man will die of starvation someday." Edwin. Biffen uses his overcoat to rescue his manuscript of Mr. Billy, Grocer, from being burned down by the apartment fire. He stuffs pages of his manuscript into the pockets of his coat and tosses it down the apartment and onto the street where it is safe from the fire. With care, he stowed the papers into the pockets of the coat. Then he rolled the garment together, tied it up in his own sleeves, took a deliberate aim, and the bundle was for the present in safety. Although the secondhand overcoat comes handy in rescuing a manuscript from being burnt down in a fire, the coat's significance diminishes shortly afterwards. As Biffen wraps his manuscript in brown paper and prepares to deliver the unexpectedly unsuccessful manuscript to his publisher, it is stated that the coat's recent experiences had brought it one stage nearly to that dissolution which must very soon be its fate. Biffen's overcoat has saved him from being judged by Amy when visiting Reardon, and it has also assisted him in saving his manuscript from a fire. These scenarios make the overcoat appear venerable and in a way even personify it. The dissolution that follows the long life of this venerable coat may foreshadow Biffen's death, which happens quite shortly afterwards in one of the remaining chapters of New Grub Street. Arguably, it would have been realistic for Amy to marry Biffen since he was Reardon's close friend. Instead, she marries Milvin. Biffen embodies the principles that Reardon upheld better than Milvin does. Milvin always swayed away from the realist principles that both Biffen and Reardon upheld. New Grub Street opens with Milvin and closes with Milvin. In both instances, Milvin keeps a distance away from realism. When the novel opens, Milvin criticizes Reardon, who is another realist writer like Biffen. In the ending of the novel, Milvin and Amy both acknowledge that the world is a glorious place, but only for rich people. Yes, for rich people. How I pity the poor devils. New Grub Street ends with Amy playing the piano and singing and Milvin laying back in dreamy bliss. It is arguable that Gissing has used Milvin's character to demonstrate that the writer who avoids realism and embraces contemporary and new genres of fiction is the writer who becomes successful. It is also arguable that Gissing uses both Reardon's and Biffen's characters to demonstrate that the writer who remains loyal towards a tradition and refrains from a writer who remains loyal towards a literary tradition and refrains from embracing a new literary tradition must suffer. The melodramatic satire in the character of Biffen makes him a character that should be sympathized. By giving Biffen such a lonely and depressing downfall and death, in addition to the unsuccessful novel that he spent so much time writing, Gissing has brutally satirized not only Biffen's story, but at the same time, he has satirized the realism that he once used to praise in his writings. A few conclusions that I gathered are: New Grub Street is a novel that was written when other genres of fiction were challenging the Victorian realist tradition. As a successful realist writer, Gissing became hopeless about the change in realism from Victorian realism to another form of realism. This hopelessness may account for the ambivalent realism that runs throughout his novel. Biffen, as a realist subject, strictly upheld realist values. His actions during the apartment fire in chapter 31, a rescue and summons, dramatically contradict the values he upheld. It creates a lack of uniformity in Biffen's character, which may disappoint some readers, but it could be that this lack of uniformity in Biffen's story represents a form of resentment that Gissing may have held against the shift in attitudes towards realism during the period in which he wrote New Grub Street. The final conclusion I wanted to make is the idea that Biffen is unable to marry Amy and commits suicide suicide over Amy is very absurd. Considering Biffen was able to save himself and his manuscript from a deadly fire, why would he commit suicide over Amy, who is not as practically ferocious as the apartment fire that could have killed him earlier in the novel? In conclusion, Gissing plans a very melodramatic death for Biffen. It could be possible that Gissing has done this in order for himself to make sense of the shift in the literary perspective towards Victorian realism at the time. This change must have had a drastic effect on Gissing's confidence, as he wrote exceptionally during the period of Victorian realism, but was unable to write confidently when the literary perspective towards realism began to change dramatically in the late 19th century. Thank you for listening to my presentation.